The day after we buried my wife, I was still wearing the same black suit when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. I had already heard enough condolences to last a lifetime. But when the man on the other end introduced himself as her lawyer, my hands went cold. My wife and I were married for 43 years, and in all that time, she never once mentioned having secrets from me. The funeral at Cedar Hill in Newark had been a gray, blurring affair. Martha deserved better than the drizzle and the shivering crowd, but she always preferred the quiet anyway. I remember the way the casket looked against the wet grass, topped with the white lilies she loved. Our daughter, Sarah, had been a pillar of strength, holding my arm so tight her knuckles turned white. She handled the caterers, the flowers, and the guest list, while I sat in my armchair staring at a television that wasn't turned on. By the time the last shovel of dirt hit the vault, I thought the hardest part was over. I thought I just had to learn how to live in a house that suddenly felt 3 times too large. Sarah stayed the night, sleeping in her old childhood bedroom, and that morning she had made a pot of coffee before heading out to run some errands for the estate. Then the phone rang. "Mr. Harrison," the voice said. It was deep, professional, and hurried. "This is Arthur Vance. I represented your wife's private interests. We need to meet today, without your daughter." I looked at the kitchen table, where Sarah's car keys usually sat. They were gone. Private interests? Martha didn't have a business, Mr. Vance. We shared everything. Our accounts, this house, 43 years of life. "That's not entirely accurate, Arthur," he replied, using my first name with a note of pity that made my stomach churn. "There are documents she signed 4 months ago, shortly after her diagnosis. She was very specific about the timing of this disclosure. Please, come to my office on Broad Street at 2 o'clock, and Mr. Harrison, check the floorboards in the back of her closet before you leave." When I hung up, the silence of the house felt heavy, like it was pressing against my lungs. I walked into our bedroom and opened Martha's closet. The scent of her perfume still lingered on her sweaters. I knelt down, my knees popping in the quiet, and pulled back the corner of the rug. One of the oak boards didn't sit flush with the others. I pried it up with a letter opener. Tucked inside was a manila envelope with my name written in her elegant, looping script. Underneath it was a second envelope, addressed to the Newark Police Department. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened the first one. The first thing I saw was a bank statement for an account I never knew existed. The balance was 0. The second thing was a series of withdrawal slips from the last 3 months, totaling over $80,000. Every single one of them bore Sarah's signature. I sat on the edge of our bed for 20 minutes, staring at the empty bank statements. $80,000. That was most of the liquid savings Martha had set aside for her long-term care, money she had inherited from her own mother and kept in a separate Newark account for peace of mind. I raised Sarah to be a person of character. I gave her everything, from the best piano lessons in New Jersey to a debt-free college education at Rutgers. I never thought I'd be holding proof that she had cleaned out her dying mother's accounts. I drove down to Broad Street, the midday traffic of downtown Newark blurring past me. Arthur Vance's office was in one of those old, dignified stone buildings that smelled of lemon polish and heavy paper. He didn't waste time with small talk. He slid a folder across the mahogany desk that contained copies of the same withdrawals I'd found under the floorboards. "Your wife came to see me in October," Vance said, his voice low. "She was weak, but her mind was sharp. She realized the money was moving, Arthur. She didn't want to believe it at first, but she checked the ledger herself." "Why didn't she tell me?" I asked, my voice cracking. "We were sitting in the same room every night. I was the one giving her the morphine." "She didn't want to break your heart," Vance replied. "And she was terrified of what Sarah would do if she was confronted while you were still grieving. But there's more. Your daughter didn't just take the cash. She had your wife sign a quitclaim deed on your summer property in Cape May. Martha thought she was signing medical power of attorney papers. She was heavily medicated, Arthur. It was a bait and switch." My chest felt like it was being crushed by a vice. That cottage was where we had spent every July for 30 years. It was supposed to be our retreat. Now, according to the land records Vance showed me, it belonged entirely to Sarah and her husband. When I got home, Sarah was in the kitchen, humming a tune while she made a salad. She looked so innocent, so helpful. She looked like the daughter I thought I knew. "Where have you been, Dad?" she asked, not looking up from the cucumbers. I was worried. "You should be resting." "I was at the bank," I said. The humming stopped. The kitchen went deathly quiet. Sarah turned around, the paring knife still in her hand, and for the first time in 32 years, I didn't recognize the expression on my daughter's face. It wasn't guilt. It was a cold, calculated defiance. "I suppose we should talk about the estate then," she said, her voice dropping all the warmth it had held seconds before. Sarah didn't even flinch. She just set the knife down on the granite counter and crossed her arms. I looked at her, searching for a trace of the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders through the Newark Museum of Art. But all I saw was a stranger. I raised her. I gave her everything, I whispered to myself, the words feeling hollow in the quiet kitchen. "Dad, don't make this emotional," she said, her voice as sharp as the blade she just put down. "Mom wasn't in her right mind at the end. She was going to let that money sit in a low-interest account while we were struggling to keep our heads above water with the mortgage in Princeton." "Struggling?" I asked, my voice rising. "You drive a car that costs more than my first house. You took 2 vacations to Europe last year while your mother was coughing up blood in that bed upstairs." She let out a short, cold laugh. "Those were business trips, and you know it. Besides, the Cape May house was just sitting there. We're going to renovate it and list it as a short-term rental. It's an asset, Dad. Not a museum for your memories." I felt a surge of heat in my chest that made my vision blur. "That house was Martha's sanctuary. You stole it from her while she was too drugged to know what her own name was. That's not an asset move, Sarah. That's a crime." "Careful with your words," she snapped, stepping toward me. "I have a power of attorney that was notarized and witnessed. If you try to challenge the deed or the withdrawals, I'll have a doctor testify that you've been showing signs of early-onset dementia. I've already started keeping a log of your confusion since the funeral." My blood ran cold. She had been planning this defense while she was holding my hand at the cemetery. She wasn't just stealing the past, she was preemptively burying my future. "Get out," I said, my voice shaking. "Get out of this house." "Fine," she said, grabbing her coat from the chair. "But check your mail tomorrow morning, Dad. You aren't the only one who visited a lawyer this week." Since Mom's name was on the deed to this house too, and she died without a formal updated will for the primary residence, I'm filing for my partition share. You might want to start looking for an apartment. I hear there are some nice senior living spots near the airport." She slammed the door, leaving me standing in a kitchen that suddenly felt like a crime scene. I went back to the closet and looked at the second envelope, the one addressed to the police. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside wasn't a letter, but a small digital recorder and a handwritten note from Martha. "Arthur, if you're reading this, she's already started. Listen to the last track." I sat in the dark for an hour, the digital recorder feeling like a lead weight in my palm. The house was silent, but the air felt charged with the echoes of Sarah's threats. I thought of the way she looked at me, her own father, as if I were nothing more than a legal obstacle to be cleared. I raised her. I gave her everything. Now, she was ready to use my own grief to label me incompetent and take the roof from over my head. I pressed play on the small device. The first few tracks were just the rustle of sheets and the muffled sounds of the Newark street outside, but the final recording was different. It was from a Tuesday night in late October. I recognized the thin, raspy quality of Martha's voice, but she sounded terrified. "I don't want to sign that, Sarah," Martha whispered on the tape. "That's the Cape May deed. Your father and I—" "Mom, just sign it." Sarah's voice cut in, cold and impatient. "The medication is making you paranoid. This is just for the insurance. Do you want the bank to take it because we can't pay the medical bills? Do you want Dad to lose everything because you're being stubborn?" "But Arthur said—" Martha started. "Arthur doesn't know the full risk," Sarah snapped, using the same dismissive tone she'd used on me earlier. "If you don't sign this, I can't protect you. I'll have to move you to a state facility because we won't be able to afford the home care. Do you want to die in a place that smells like bleach and neglect?" There was a long silence, then the sound of a pen scratching against paper. Then Sarah's voice again, lighter now. "There, see? That wasn't so hard. Now take your pills and go to sleep." I felt a coldness settle into my bones that no heater could touch. It wasn't just a formality or a misunderstanding. It was coercion. It was a daughter using her mother's fear of a nursing home to strip her of her dignity. The next morning, the mail arrived exactly as Sarah had predicted. It was a formal notice from a law office downtown, a partition suit to force the sale of the house. She was giving me 30 days to vacate or face formal proceedings. I didn't call her. I didn't beg. Instead, I drove to the Newark Police Department with a manila envelope and the recorder. As I sat in the waiting room, surrounded by the hum of a city that didn't care about my heartbreak, I realized that the private family matter Sarah wanted to keep quiet was about to become very public. The detective in the Newark precinct looked at me with a tired professional sympathy as he listened to the recording. He didn't say much at first, just tapped his pen against a copy of the bank statements showing the $80,000 drain. I sat there, a 72-year-old man in a wrinkled suit, realizing that my daughter's private family matter was now a matter of state evidence. "This is coercion, Mr. Harrison," he finally said. "And combined with the signature on that deed while your wife was medicated, we're looking at elder financial exploitation." I left the station and drove straight to Sarah's house in Princeton. I didn't call ahead. When I pulled into her paved driveway, I saw the new SUV she'd bought last month, likely with Martha's long-term care money. I felt a coldness in my chest that had replaced the grief. Sarah opened the door, her face tightening when she saw me. "I told you to talk to my lawyer, Dad. You're trespassing." "I'm not here to talk about the house," I said, my voice steady. "I'm here to tell you that the Newark police have the recording of you threatening your mother to sign that deed." She went pale, the bravado vanishing for a split second before she masked it with a sneer. "You're bluffing." Mom was confused. "Anything she recorded is inadmissible." "It's not just the recording, Sarah," I replied. "It's the forensic trail of the bank transfers. I raised you, I gave you everything, and you rewarded that by making your mother's last weeks a living nightmare because you wanted a rental property. You're blowing up this family over a pile of bricks," she screamed, her voice echoing across the quiet suburban street. "You blew it up when you stole from a dying woman," I said quietly. As I turned to walk back to my car, 2 Newark police cruisers pulled up behind me. They didn't come for a chat. They had a warrant for her arrest on charges of grand larceny and financial exploitation of the elderly. I watched as they handcuffed my daughter on her own front porch while her neighbors watched from behind their curtains. I didn't feel like a hero. I just felt empty. Watching the handcuffs click around Sarah's wrists was a sight that should have broken me, but I felt strangely numb. The neighbors in her quiet Princeton cul-de-sac stood on their lawns, phones out, recording the fall of the woman who always acted like she was better than them. She didn't look like a high-powered executive anymore. She looked like a cornered animal, screaming that I was destroying her life. I drove back to our house in Newark and sat in the kitchen, the silence ringing in my ears. The partition suit she had filed was still active, a lingering threat from her lawyers, but the criminal charges changed the leverage. I spent the next 3 days in meetings with Arthur Vance in the prosecutor's office. They showed me the digital trail. Sarah hadn't just taken the $80,000. She had tried to take out a second mortgage on our primary home by forging Martha's signature 3 weeks before the end. She was drowning in her own lifestyle, Vance told me, leaning back in his leather chair. The Princeton house, the private schools, the cars, it was all built on a foundation of sand. She saw your wife's illness as a closing window of opportunity. I raised her. I gave her everything. I paid for her weddings and her mistakes, yet she saw her mother's death as a way to balance her checkbook. The public humiliation was swift. The local Newark papers picked up the story. Local executive charged with exploiting terminally ill mother. Sarah's firm placed her on administrative leave, and her husband, who had been complicit in the Cape May deed, was facing his own set of questions from the police. On Friday, her lawyer called me. He wasn't arrogant anymore. He sounded desperate. "Mr. Harrison, Sarah is willing to sign back the Cape May deed and drop the partition suit on your house. She'll even agree to a restitution plan for the $80,000. All she asks is that you speak to the prosecutor about dropping the criminal complaint. This conviction will end her career." I looked at the photo of Martha on the mantel. I thought about the recording of her crying, terrified of being sent to a state facility while her own daughter hovered over her like a vulture. "Tell her I'll see her in court," I said, and I hung up the phone. The trial in Newark lasted 4 days. I sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing the same black suit I had worn to Martha's funeral. Sarah sat at the defense table, her expensive blowout replaced by flat hair and a gray cardigan that made her look small. She wouldn't meet my eyes when the prosecutor played the recording of her threatening to put her mother in a state facility. The jury reached a verdict in less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts of elder financial exploitation and grand larceny. The judge didn't offer her much leniency, citing the calculated cruelty of targeting a terminally ill parent. Sarah was sentenced to 3 years in a state correctional facility, with an order for full restitution. Her husband filed for divorce 2 weeks later, trying to distance himself from the wreckage of the life they had built on stolen money. I didn't stay for the sentencing. I drove down to the house in Cape May that afternoon. The air was salt-heavy and cold, and the porch was covered in a layer of winter grit. I spent the weekend clearing out the modern furniture Sarah had moved in, replacing it with the old wicker chairs Martha loved. I raised her. I gave her everything. I used to think that meant I had succeeded as a father, but standing in that quiet house, I realized you can give a child the world and still fail to give them a conscience. The Cape May deed is back in my name now. The partition suit on the Newark house was dismissed by the court. I live alone in the house where Martha and I spent 43 years, surrounded by the silence of a family that no longer exists. Every Tuesday, I go to Cedar Hill and sit by her grave for an hour. I tell her about the garden and the weather. I don't talk about Sarah. I don't tell her that our daughter is behind bars or that I'm the one who put her there. I kept my promise to protect Martha. It only cost me the rest of my life. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There's more to come.